Okay, so welcome to the third of our Decolonizing Dissertations event. This is called Reflections on the Decolonizing the PhD, part 2. First of all, welcome on this very cold day. And help yourself during the session to snacks, juice, and coffee. And I would like, first of all, before we get started, to take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 in southern Alberta. This includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, which comprise the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, which includes the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. I'd also like to note that the University of Calgary is situated on land adjacent to where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, and the traditional Blackfoot name of the place is Mohkinstsis, which we now call the city of Calgary. So I have a couple of introductory comments to make, and I have to take, these are reading glasses, so I can't see anybody. So this, we asked for students doing their PhD programs to do this third session, talking about their experiences and their thoughts for how we might improve graduate education here. And because Vicki and I have been, I wouldn't say disorganized, but Vicki and I have been trying to set up mostly Vicki has been trying to set up a graduate, Indigenous graduate mentoring program. And we've been doing that and facing a large number of financial obstacles, which lets us know that the Indigenous strategy really needs to get going around finance. So I want to talk a little bit before we introduce the speakers about the SAGE mentoring program. SAGE has been now running on all UBC, SFU, UNBC campuses in BC for quite some years now, since 2004, I think, and is also running at the U of T campus. So Vicki and a number of other graduate students are involved in a project to get a SAGE mentoring program started here at U of C, and thinking big, we're thinking that maybe we can get the other universities at U of A and U of L involved as well. So there's been lots of discussions about mentoring of Indigenous students here in Alberta, and particularly here at University of Calgary. So with that in mind, the discussion today, when we asked the 4 participants today some questions, we focused on mentoring and the lack thereof, or what their ideas were about mentoring as their final set of questions for today. But we also asked them about something, the kind of thing that's often invisible to many people, and this project is sponsored in part by the Faculty of Graduate Studies, and that is the additional work or labor that Indigenous graduate students have to do to just get their programs done. So I asked them, So we've been talking with one of the investigators on that project, Carly Fellner, who was a grad coordinator for SAGE at UBC. And so one of the things that we'll be, well, I shouldn't be speaking for Vicki. One of the things that has been happening is that AIM High and this GSA-funded SAGE project have been sitting down to talk about doing work together, and Carly in particular was very committed to having AIM High expand to a whole SAGE network for graduate students and Indigenous faculty mentors. So maybe that's a discussion we can have at the fourth event in this series. The other questions that we asked the participants were about the kind of work or labor, the invisible labor that many of them felt that they had encountered in their program or had to do, how they also supported themselves, what strategies they used to seek support, and then their thoughts on mentorship. So they had 5 questions that we put to them, and we're going to ask them to each speak informally for a few minutes, not very long, to talk amongst each other, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. They are going to introduce themselves first, and finally, this session was, you'll see from the ads that the session was slated to last for 2 hours. We have reserved a little over half an hour of that time for graduate students to meet informally and talk amongst themselves about SAGE and about the final session in this series. Is there anything else, Vicki? Okay. Vicki Bouvier will be moderating this session when we go out into the Q&As.
So yeah, Joshua is going to go first, and you just have to click that on, and I'll shut mine off.
It's on? Oh, okay, it's on. Tansei folks. My name is Joshua Whitehead. I come from Peguis First Nation in Manitoba, which is on the Treaty 1 territories. I'm a graduate student here at the Department of English at the University of Calgary, focusing on Indigenous literatures and cultures through the English department. I'm a bit of jack of all trades. I do creative writing, I do critical work, and then a braid of the two as well. So I thought I would just kind of move through some of the questions that were asked and that Aruna kind of pointed out now. So I got my list ready to go. But so the question was, have you experienced through institutional structures, personal resistance or lack of comprehension about the kind of research, teaching, or community work you are engaged in, additional work or labor that you feel students and scholars do not, or your other students and scholars do not? So I had quite a few, and I'm going to kind of try and jump through them as quickly as I can. But I would suppose like the first one was my own lack of knowledge in terms of Indigenous literatures and cultures. So I did my Bachelor of Arts and my Master's at the University of Winnipeg. My Bachelor of Arts was in English, and my MA was in Cultural Studies, and that took about 7 years. And through those 7 years, I had absolutely no time to focus on anything that was Indigenous literatures or cultures while there. I did try to attempt to take some directed readings. Those were shot down. So my focus was primarily on the canons of English literature, Canadian literature, American literature, and basically like settler knowledge at large. So I guess my ability to kind of relate my Indigenous literatures and cultures and my Indigenous knowledge from the communities, I was mostly self-taught or autodidactic in those forms. I took the knowledge that I would gain from home and from working with Indigenous youth through the friendship centers in Manitoba and Winnipeg. So I had all this knowledge, but trying to bring that to the classroom was a difficult, and still kind of remains a difficult thing, because I don't have this kind of stamp of approval. I'm not 100% well-read, as my committee, well, I'll talk a little bit later, as my committee kind of pointed out through my major field. So trying to bring this knowledge to the table was quite difficult, I find, and I would often kind of feel inadequate because that tutelage in my field, that is Indigenous epistemologies, I suppose, is woefully underdeveloped as compared to some of my colleagues who took 7-8 years, and they're well-read and well-rounded in their own fields, such as like early modern literature or Canadian literature or American lit. So because of my trying to bring, I guess, my oral understanding of my communities and this kind of embodied knowledge to the table, to these classrooms, to the academy at large, was difficult because I felt many times it was often read as not valid because I couldn't cite the fact that I had a conversation with an elder during a powwow, or talking with communities and aunties and uncles. Like the fact that it was not published and it wasn't stamped of approval from a publishing house often is read as invalid, and trying to use that type of knowledge in an essay or any type of research is often frowned upon, I felt like, through all 3 of my degrees. So my program also has a secondary language requirement. So I knew coming in this was going to be my hardest and probably my most difficult challenge in the hoops that I have to jump through. But I spent 6 to 7 months almost searching for an Indigenous language that I could take through 3 different provinces and through about 6 or 7 different universities. Many times that it would be running, it would be canceled because there wasn't no enrollment, or there was no instructors who could teach the Indigenous languages. Luckily, I found a Nihiawi and a Cree language course here, which I was able to take, and through a lot of the help and the generosity of my department, I was able to waive this secondary language requirement after having completed this course with a successful grade. But I was just kind of feeling about this kind of desire, and I felt there was a kind of a push to like learn a secondary language such as French or Spanish, or like trying to like take on another colonial language. So I'm so happy that I was able to take on my own Indigenous languages and then apply that to my own research and my own ways of being and navigating the world. But with other Indigenous kin that I speak to, they still kind of encounter these same barriers for this lack of, I guess, availability for Indigenous languages in academia. I wanted to speak a little bit on teaching in the classroom and the department, as I often feel and have felt that I am the native informant in the classroom, in the department, and in academia. And while many folks did listen to what I had to offer, I often became or was sought out to be the stamp of approval for their research or their ideas, or the go-to person for their questions, their anxieties, their desires, their fantasies, etc. So I can't even tell you how many times I would have folks come to my office hours and speak to me. One example was that one of my fellow colleagues asked me to help him indigenize his shirk list so that he could receive funding, not knowing the sheer amount of work I put into my own shirk, to creating my own bibliography, to creating my own thesis and my own original arguments based within Nihiawian epistemologies. Again, through my tutelage and coming up through creative writing, and specifically, a course I took here, I was also working with a colleague who wanted to create a fictional Indigenous tribe, and would email me constantly asking for references. Is this okay? Am I doing this correctly? So really trying to get me to validate their fictions, I suppose. So a lot of times these consultations, I call them consultations, they just call them informal questions. They're asking me to kind of give my knowledge, my 8-9 years now of academia, and my lived embodied knowledge of being an Indigenous Cree, OG Cree person from Treaty 1 territory for free. So not reading this type of knowledge sharing and this type of labor as something profitable to me. Again, I feel like myself, I kind of come from perhaps a unique perspective, working as a creative writer and as a critical person, a theorist, an essayist, a nonfiction writer. So if folks aren't aware of kind of what's been happening in CanLit right now, like with UBC Accountable, but more specifically, I was involved in the Right magazine last year with the Appropriation Prize. So I feel like I had quite a large blowback. So a lot of, I think, psychic and mental damage, and spiritual, cultural damage that was done to me through online activism and through Twitter trolls and the likes of John Kay, Angie Abdu, and other folks from the departments and from without. But I feel like this type of blowback or this type of psychic damage that I have to navigate is something none of my colleagues have to deal with, or very little of them do. Specifically placing myself and my work within, I suppose, an activist lens is something I don't think a lot of other colleagues kind of have to work with or kind of tuffle with, I suppose. So I feel, because of the type of work that I do, I don't consider it activism, I just consider it decolonizing, and almost like land and story protection. But I feel like a lot of this times, specifically with the kind of pushback I've been, lending towards kind of, decolonizing and disrupting CanLit, I feel like places me within precarious situations within the larger fields of Canadian literature, but also within my own departments, because some folks are so heavily invested in those fields and so heavily invested in historical literature without wanting to kind of, decolonize that a bit, right? To kind of move beyond what, the canonical white settler, male, cis writers we have, and trying to diversify that. So I feel like a lot of times I'm put into these uncomfortable or precarious situations with folks who I don't work with regularly. And again, my first year here, coming to the University of Calgary and having to TA a creative writing course where I was actively teaching my students how to appropriate through the likes of Kenny Goldsmith. So that in itself was its own kind of fun thing to navigate. So within our PhD program, we also have something called a comprehensive exam, which is basically a reading of canonical literature and then doing a 3-part exam on it afterwards. So I've spoken with Aruna and some other folks in the department. It's a reading list of about roughly 100 authors, but on a percentage scale, less than 20% of that list were by BIPOC writers, BIPOC meaning Black, Indigenous people of color, and less than 3% were by Indigenous authors. And just in terms of sheer, like, there's this large list of 100 texts, but then there's about 100 different authors, 90 to 100, I would say. And they have different lengths. So sometimes it could just be like read a short poem, or versus like read a 500-page Charles Dickens novel. So I was kind of doing this in terms of page scale. So it was very, very limited in terms of BIPOC, and even more so limited in terms of Indigenous authors. And just trying to navigate this exam, I was asked to read through stories of appropriation and cannibalization by white settlers, and then felt I was almost asked to annihilate myself through the recollection of colonial trauma on a daily basis. So we had 4 months, roughly. You needed to kind of read 1 book a day and just kind of continue in that fashion. While I didn't think that there was much consideration in the topics of mental health in doing these readings, and perhaps I don't think my colleagues, specifically my graduate colleagues, I don't think they think about the affect in the same way as I was doing. So having to read through something like some Thomas King, and then reading through Maori, New Zealand, Indigenous literatures have been colonized, then African, and then Chinese. It was just a lot of, for me, it was a lot of mental hoops to jump through to keep reliving these traumas that I myself have survived and lived through. I think coming into this exam, I was quite distraught in going through the readings, and in speaking with my colleagues, there was a very little lack of understanding or empathy in that. The kind of, I guess, the overall mantra was just push through it. Don't take it on a personal level. It's not political. Art is art for art's sake, and art is always kind of removed from this political sphere. For me, it never is. Reading and writing is always political. So to read a book a day with these degrees of trauma and pain embedded, traumas and pain I myself have felt, I think was a whole other task that my colleagues and perhaps some folks in my department weren't aware of. So we also have to do a candidacy exam, which is now called a major field exam. And for mine, there was an Indigenous list, but it was global. But I wanted to create something that was wholly centered based on the Indigenous literatures and of the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. So I created my own list, which took about 4 months of doing research and asking folks, which text should I use? How can I create a more diverse list to include female Indigenous writers, Two-Spirit, or queer, trans, non-binary Indigenous folks in this list? Because those are the folks, even when we do have these lists, who are wholly left out. We seem to always want to turn to Thomas King. So I felt that the amount of work required of me to create my own reading list and to radically shift its structures, so we based it less on genre and less on time periods, and we placed it more within Indigenous epistemologies of Indian time or something that was more holistic, and we based it on land bases. So we'd have like the plains Indigenous literature, the woodlands, etc., rather than saying 1970s, 1980s. So we radically restructured that. I had to call upon all my kin in order to make this list. I had to shift and be in quite a bit of conversation with Daniel Heath Justice tweets. So we did 365 days of Indigenous literatures and relied on a lot of online help through Indian Twitter, as folks like to call it, and Facebook. This work set me back in terms of my timeline by a good 4 to 6 months, as did the language requirement. I think none of my colleagues had to undergo. I am the only Indigenous student in the department that I'm aware of. And when I first came here, I was told that if I do finish, I will be the first Indigenous student to ever finish this degree. I have met another Indigenous scholar now who was a part of this department and told me that she left because, again, there was no mentorship, there was a lack of visibility, and just a lack of scholarship being done in her fields. It was totally inhibiting her. And I felt the same thing. The pressure of being the first and joining the department with a less diverse community made it difficult for me to navigate the terrains of academia. And then just the sheer amount of work I'm required to do to maintain the agency and the standing and the respect I feel I have in the department. So I have 2 books published, one forthcoming, a book co-editing that's forthcoming, dozens of articles and creative pieces, many invited speaking engagements across Turtle Islands, in academia and in communities, and then having to also kind of stake my claim in the politics of CanLit. So I think just the sheer amount of work that I've done, I think some of my colleagues fail in comparison to that. And don't see why I'm kind of doing this. I'm not simply writing to receive an A or to receive a good grade or to boost my GPA. For me, the work that I do, creative, critical, inside the academy and out, is to procure a futurism and a livability and a safer space for Indigenous peoples who may follow in my footsteps here. So I did a small little. So from Peguis First Nation, there was the graduates, the grade 12 graduates, came to the University of Calgary to do a kind of a scouting of the place. So I hold that near and dear to my heart at the fact that they would come here to visit me. I think I'm one of the first, a handful of folks who have used their funding through their home nations in order to kind of take on the PhD. So for me, I felt a large responsibility and a lot of accountability to my own communities to pave the way, to break down doors, to make space, and to etch out space where there wasn't any before. So for me, I suppose my strategy is just always keeping that in mind, to remember who I'm working for and what I'm working for. And again, I could not have done any of the work that I've done here specifically without my committee members, Dr. Larissa Lai, Dr. Derek Mason, Dr. Rain Prudhomme-Cranford, and Aruna as well, who have just been nothing but amazing saving graces, and have kept me like in check and thinking healthy and being healthy, and have supported me 100% through this way. So without them, I would not have been able to, and I don't even think, survive this department. So I owe them so much, and I hope that the work that we're doing is going to make it better and easier and safer for Indigenous folks who follow afterwards. Hi, thank you.
Hi. Okay, Siksika. I'm supposed to give a shout out to Siksika Outreach School. My students are watching right now. And the community of Siksika is watching. And the community of Red Sucker Lake First Nation in Manitoba is watching. And Tsuut'ina Police Service is watching. So we have an audience here. I just like to say, Natanako Pearl Yellowed Woman, and Siksika Tabi. I am Blackfoot from the Blackfoot Confederacy of the Siksika Nation, and I am also OG Cree from the Red Sucker Lake First Nation of Manitoba, and I am from the Harper family. I'd just like to acknowledge that we are in Treaty 7 territory, and these are the lands of my ancestral grandfathers and grandmothers. And I am happy to be here speaking as an Indigenous Siksika scholar. I am a second year PhD student with the Cummings School of Medicine, specifically in community health sciences, and I'm specializing in community rehabilitation and disability studies. I think I'm just supposed to introduce myself and then pass it on. So. You go ahead. Are you sure? I just want to pass the torch. I'm so nervous.
Do you want me to go?
Okay, we're going to introduce ourselves. Am I on? I'm good. Okay. My name is Corey Chewy. I'm Cree Métis Polish. I was born by the Peace River Treaty 8, and my family is the Jobin family of Red River. I'm a PhD candidate at Workland School. I guess it's been a long journey for me getting here, and I actually started my bachelor's here back in, I'm going to date myself. Back in 1999, I did my bachelor's here, and now I'm back. So it's nice to be back on homeland. I'm doing my PhD in ethnomathematics and looking at Indigenous ways of knowing ethnomathematics, and I'll get into that later. We're good? We're good? Okay.
Hello. I said to Pearl before we started, oh gosh, I have to use a microphone. I haven't used one of these since elementary school. So my name is Ashley. I am Mi'kmaq First Nation from the Kipu region on the western peninsula of Newfoundland, and I am also Irish and French. I was born and raised in southern Ontario, and I've been fortunate to live in the Atikameksheng and Anishinaabeg territory in northern Ontario for the past 7.5 years, where I did my undergraduate degree in biomedical sciences, and then had this life-changing experience, which I will talk about later, and I decided to do my Master's of Interdisciplinary Health at Laurentian University as well. I'm a first-year PhD student in community health sciences. I moved here in September, and since being here in Treaty 7, I've been welcomed with open arms, and I've met so many wonderful people, and I was really heartbroken to leave the land in which I was living because I made so many connections, and I thought, oh, now you have to start over and go to Calgary and meet new people and try and figure out how you fit there and how you belong. But I can say the past 4 months has been quite an experience being here, and I'm so grateful to the people that I've met. And yeah, I'll share some more after. Go ahead, Pearl.
Well, coming from personal experience, I guess I'll just share my lived experience. In the words of our late Indigenous author, Richard Wagamis, you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you came from. So who are you? And that's the question that my grandparents have always taught me since I was a child, is uningin, who are you? Or dagagistu, who are you? And it's really important as you're growing up to have that cultural mentorship from your elders, from your family, and to have those oral traditions passed on to you each and every day, because it strengthens you as an Indigenous person within the community, especially when you're faced with adversity and trials and tribulations as you continue on into this academic world, because it's a really confusing place, especially when you have the reservation life is all you know. And I remember coming here on this campus. Actually, this building wasn't here. It was a parking lot, and I had $2 in my pocket, and I had to make a choice of, do I use that $2 for parking, or do I use the $2 for food? So I've come from that experience of driving from Siksika, bumming gas money to get here. So it's been a long journey, and I just appreciate that process because it's strengthened me as a person. And this, I don't know where the journey is gonna end because I'm still on this path. And in Siksika we say, Kakayosin, which means you're coming to know. And then I've thought that we have 4 cycles in our life. And through those cycles, you will come to understand at a time when you need to know, when the Creator allows you to understand. And I remember going on this journey and thinking, can I do it? I felt so incompetent. I felt that I wasn't good enough to be here. That inferior, I just felt inferior to, can I do this? And then I wanted to do it my way. And I thought I wanted to do the Siksika way, and so I put an application in and I just prayed to the PhD program because I completed 3 previous degrees and I've done it all with the Western lens, with the Western approach. And I thought, no, this time I'm going to do it infused and informed with the traditional ways of knowledge and the teachings, because we had these in place. And these are just as legitimate as the theories that they teach you here in this institution. I'm just going to pause here.
Okay. So I mentioned earlier that I'm doing my PhD with a focus on ethnomathematics through an Indigenous way of knowing. If you think about that for a second, it seems very contradictory. And it has been a journey just to, I guess, validate that there are different ways of looking at mathematics. It's not just this one set perspective, this universal right and wrong kind of perspective of mathematics. So I'd like to kind of start out by sharing a quote from Linda Tuhuai Smith out of New Zealand, and she wrote a lot about Maori Indigenous methodologies, and she said, researchers are trained to conform to standard models. Indigenous research is judged as not rigorous, not robust, not real, not theorized, not valid, not reliable. So I get confronted by this all the time when I'm trying to explain what is ethnomathematics. And really, if we look at this through an Indigenous perspective, we look at and understand the stories that our elders tell us, there's so much math, there's so much science, and just understanding our connections with the land and how we navigate those connections. And it's, writing kind of my process of my research up until candidacy and even now, and trying to navigate, I'm trying to look at these Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous perspectives of mathematics, and how do I validate these and make them, make them valid for my proposal, for all these steps I have to go through, those Western steps that I have to go through to do my candidacy and kind of do the next steps. And an example of this is I'm using spirit journals for the participants in my research to, to record moments throughout the workshops I'll be doing. Those aha moments, those moments when, you kind of listen to your intuition of what you're creating, and how valuable those moments are, and how that allows us to really understand that we're learning at that point, and to really focus on that moment. And that's not as much, that's a lot more difficult to validate and talk about, and to make it a form of data collection as a questionnaire. You can say in your proposal, there's a question, I'm going to do questionnaires or focus groups. Okay, done. No, now I have to say, I'm looking at spirit journals. You must, listen to how are you feeling at this moment of learning, and this aha moment, or even a dream, how important dreams are in Indigenous ways of knowing, and how that is a way of knowing, and that is collective. And it's, it's not one paragraph of saying, I'm going to do a questionnaire, as opposed to 10 pages of trying to validate why I'm using spirit journals, right? So it's and I think a lot of things we're talking about is time as well, and how the amount of time, excess time that we are taking through this process to, using an Indigenous lens, using Indigenous ways of knowing, and that extra time. Like what Josh said about always getting questions, and always being that go-to, and I think it's really important. And I think we all here we want the work that we're doing, and to be done in a good way. And I think we want to take this extra time to do this and to help others. But you're always on the clock. You're always working. You never really have that button to turn off, right? So I'm gonna stop there, and then we'll move on.
So the way that I kind of approached mentorship through academia, it started with mentorship in my own personal life. And I've always been encouraged, supported. I've been sometimes forced to not give up, as being a first-generation post-secondary graduate in my family, with my brother closely following me, even though we're 8 years apart. My parents always said, we thought we would be finished before he started, but I'm not. I'm still going. And it always came from a place of love, and it always came from a place of encouragement, but coming into academia, it was kind of a different way of being mentored. So through my undergraduate program, it was very heavily Western-based, and this is what healthcare is, and this is what medicine is. And I was aspiring, I still am, to go to medical school. So I thought that this is what it meant to become a doctor, to want to help people, to want to better the health or the well-being of people in Canada. So I finished my degree, didn't get into medical school, and I thought, what am I going to do with my life now? So I decided to go back to a place where we don't really, go back to something that we don't really talk about in my family, and that's our Indigenous identity. And it's not because we don't want to talk about it, but a lot of members of my family don't know how to talk about it. And that's just because of where they lived, and the settlers who came to the land, and French sort of dominated the family, and that's just the way it was, and you didn't talk about it, you didn't really ask questions. So I branched off and I took a course in Aboriginal health and wellness through the University of Sudbury. And I remember after my first lecture, in the first chapter of Rupert Ross's book, it's the purple one, he has 3. I think it's the second of 3. I see someone nodding, correct me if I'm wrong. And I remember reading that first chapter and thinking, what did I just spend 4 years doing? I had this thought put in my mind that this is what medicine is, and this is what health is, and this is what you need to know, Ashley. So the class and the people that I met in the class, our guest speakers, the professor, their mentorship inspired me and helped me get to where I am today here talking to you. And through that experience, I decided I'm going to go to graduate school. And my experience being a master's student at Laurentian University was an experience that I'm not sure many people can have. It was not only through the coursework that I was able to take, and I was kind of able to develop my pathway without people saying, no, you have to come back here. I was allowed to veer around on this winding path or winding journey. And it brought me to a community that blessed me with a lot of voices that I probably wouldn't have heard otherwise if I didn't take that class through the University of Sudbury the year prior. And that mentorship and their stories helped me realize who I am, because I always had this question, why is that a part of our family that we're not allowed to talk about? So their mentorship didn't only help me through my academic process of, writing an ethics application and trying to get this review board to understand, why I wasn't bringing a lawyer with me and how community was helping develop this project. It wasn't me going in as an outsider. It was coming from the community, and it's something that they wanted, and it was sort of being developed from their perspective. And if it's being developed from their perspective, then it's being developed in a good way. And I had trouble from that academic view, not from my direct committee or from the program, but just from an institution as a whole, always questioning, well, why? Why aren't you just giving a questionnaire? Why can't they just say yes or no? Why do you need to hear their stories? And the stories helped with the project, and they are continuing to help develop our end goal, but they also helped me on an individual level. And I think that that's something that a lot of people don't understand, is that extra labor, that, I'm not just here to write a paper and to get it published. Sometimes there's a deeper or a covered or an inside process that a lot of people don't see. And now having engaged in that journey, there's another aspect or a part of labor that you don't see, that I've sort of become that teacher to my own family members. And I feel responsible that I need to go back and share those experiences with them, because unfortunately they weren't able to do that for different reasons. And I see that as my sort of gift back to them, that you've guided me this far in my life, and you continue to guide me with your mentorship. So now it's me giving this back to you. So labor doesn't always come from this academic. I know that you guys touched on people asking you questions and wanting your perspectives and knowing your reading lists and who you're going to talk to. But there's a lot of personal labor that comes with that, that I think you need to be, that not you. I don't mean it as you, every one of you. I just mean people in general need to be understanding of, and you really have to take care of yourself coming into an institution where you're always going to be questioned, or you're always going to have something that someone's not going to agree with, or a methodology that doesn't align with someone somewhere. So it's a personal and academic experience combined together, and a lot of people forget about that personal component, but we need to be cognizant of that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think what I'm hearing is not only personal and academic, but the spiritual challenges that you face, and Pearl sort of touched on that way of being, and also the physical taxation as well. I'm going to open it up to the audience. Welcome the little one. How awesome. It just reminds me, I have a 13-year-old, and so I did my undergrad 2007, and I would bring him as much as I possibly could to the institution, to the university, because I didn't have anybody to lead my way here, and so that is awesome. So thank you for bringing the spirit in that capacity. So I'm going to open it up to the audience for questions, and all that I ask is that you make the question broad enough that all of the panelists can answer. So if you wanted to just put up your hand, I'll bring you a mic, and then we can start off with some questions. I was going to say bravery.
Oh no, we just have to give them a minute to think, that's all.
So thank you all very much. It was really enjoyable to listen to you and to understand your experiences. And my question sort of comes off of one of the really insightful things that I found that Josh said about those comprehensive exams and the role that students often sometimes are not allowed to take in determining that exams and how that can limit your development and your experience. And one thing I was wondering is if you could speak to, Josh, obviously you had a really intense experience of having to design your own list, is how we can, or what you might recommend for departmental guidelines of how we should encourage our students to be partners in that exam process, right? How do you make it so it's not that top-down, let's interrogate you in the field, but let's help you become a part of this so you are establishing canon, I thought that was a really great experience. You got to have as much challenge as it was. It seemed very rewarding.
Well, I guess for me, there was opportunities that the department gave me that I could, help them to shift or alter or give my feedback so that the department itself could do that. But after the 4 months of reading it and then a month of writing it, I had no energy to do that. And I didn't want to take on another task of my already overburdened workload. But for me, I think just being vocal about it and being unabashed about what bothered me and what was working and just allowing the department to kind of sit in that discomfort that I was creating for it was, I think, a driving force. And now I hear that it's been shifting and it's changing, but it's still not, I think, at that limit to where I would like to see it, where I think other BIPOC writers or academics would like to see it. How to change that, I don't know. And I don't think I think it begins on an individual level, and I think it does take, if you can kind of maintain that decolonial effort and gain allies through your colleagues and whatnot, and then bring that to the department. But to change it, I think, is asking to shift the entire institution itself. Because this is a singular structure, but those singular structures are all braided again to this kind of machination that is academia, right? So I think it also needs to be, it's the work we're doing right now, right? To decolonize the dissertation, but to implement these Indigenous initiatives, where we can think about, implementing ways of knowing that aren't Western-based, 24/7, 365 days a year. So I think for me, as I'm going to move forward, I'm going to be more vocal about decolonizing who we think of as canon and who we think of as writers we need to know, and why do we need to know that? Or their alternative methods can be like learn Freud through Indigenous psychoanalysts as well, right? Or rethinking what we're knowing and why we're knowing, I think is the question I'm going to keep in mind as I move forward. And in keeping that in mind, and in keeping within the ways of being of Nehiyawewen, or the Cree epistemologies, is always kind of linking that back to the land. Specifically in a literary-based, I suppose, field, I think of literature as a land claim, and I think of the larger the systems or the larger canons of CanLit as a literary landscape too. So if I can keep pushing and even keep creating my own literatures that are going to disrupt and alter that a bit, I think for me that's the way I'm going to keep moving forward. But I think as a larger whole, it's going to be, it's not just us fixing this little bit, it's all kind of connected, right? So it's, again, a reshifting and a rethinking of what academia is, how it looks like, how it feels like, and how it acts.
Thank you.
If I could add to that, I think also, I know I've had this conversation with a few people, is I think what help also is having the ability to have elders and knowledge keepers on your committee, like, to be there in candidacy and in defense. And that would be really helpful to have that support and that mentorship as well. One thing that I did before my candidacy is I invited my committee to smudge with me, which was a fantastic way to just kind of start in ceremony and just kind of, actually one of my committee members said, I was going to ask you some really, really difficult questions, but now I just feel so good and calm. So that's a good tactic. A little hint there for you guys. But it was a lovely way to kind of start out and kind of get that kind of those nerves. Yeah.
I agree. I think that is again a bit mentoring too, right? I should have said that, because again, I think I don't have the time or the energy to do the work because I'm the only Indigenous student in that department, right? And there's only one other Indigenous hire, faculty hire, Dr. Rain Prudhomme Cranford, who just joined. So I think it also has to do, again, with creating mentors and allies in the department, and then broadening out who we're hiring. So.
Is it on? I'm just going to add a note to that with regards to allies. I think that if you are fortunate enough to work with or collaborate with a specific group of people, that should sort of be an example on a department level. For example, in my master's, there were only a few of us who were partaking in Indigenous health research from a community-based perspective, and everyone kind of thought, what are you doing? What are you talking about? But following that, when they came to the end, to the defense, they used it as an example and kind of like a learning or a building block to say, oh, that's how that's done, instead of just trying to make changes that they didn't really understand how to do. So sometimes it's unfortunate for the people who are the example, but when you have a supportive team and you have community and you have elders that are there to help you, it makes the world of difference.
In regards to conducting research in the community, I get asked a lot from non-Indigenous students, well, how do you conduct ethical Indigenous research in the community if you're not Indigenous? And that's a really tough question. And I say, well, have you been to the community? And quite often they'll say no. And so, well, how are you going to know if you're conducting research with a community if you haven't been to the community? It's really important that you need to build the connection and relationship, and that's very, very vital when you are going to even embark on doing research with the community. And I say with, not on. And it takes a lot of time, and I notice that sometimes in academia, we don't have the time. We have deadlines to meet. And this paper has to be done, and this has to be done. But it doesn't work like that with Indigenous people. It's on their time, And this past year, I've been spending a lot of time with the elders of the community because they're the leaders of our community, the grandmothers of our community. And they share stories, and they share ways of how this research is going to take place. They define the question with me. and it's an issue that's apparent in the community. So if it's empowered by the community, decided by the community, then changes are going to happen. That's where reconciliation happens, is that action takes place. Start on both sides. It takes two parties, but we have to lead it. We have to ride the horse, not be the guide leading the horse. That was what an elder had told me. And he goes, and keep it simple. Write for us, talk for us, use our language, do it the Siksika way. Know who you are. Be empowered by your ancestors. The knowledge is there. Use it. And that really, really strengthens me as I'm on this journey. And they also say, be careful, because there's going to be spirits out there or forces that will try to take you off that path, and they could potentially hurt you. And to pray and to protect yourselves. Remember that spiritual aspect of yourself. To smudge. And I know that it's really hard here, and I'm really apprehensive at times to give recognition to my spiritual side, because at times it's not deemed acceptable. Just over at the Cummings School of Medicine, and I always say this as an example of when I walked in the parking lot and I seen 2 Indigenous people smudging in the parking lot. And that really spoke a lot to me. And it hurt me that they had to take something so sacred that was so important for their health, and they had to go outside into a parking lot to do that. And in order to create good policies, health policies that are going to work for the Indigenous people, it has to be led by the Indigenous people. We have policies in place, but are they working? When you look at the literature and you look at the literature review, when I was going through my literature review, I was so distraught. I went into this mourning period and I was crying, and I phoned my supervisor and I said, this is so dark. They pathologize the Indigenous people of the population. Every single article is the overrepresentation of children and child welfare, the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people with diabetes, the overrepresentation of trauma, of residential school abuse. And it was saddened, and it saddened me. And I said, why can't we provide a research or do some kind of literature that focuses on the resilience of these people? Focus a strength-based approach with the people. And when you start from there, from the ground up, then you're going to start seeing changes. And I get so worried all the time about I don't have the fancy words to say what I need to say. All these pedagogy, epistemology, like ontology, la-la-la-logy, right? Like, what the heck does that mean? Just like phenomenology. Just like what my OG Cree auntie said, and what you gotta go wreck a good story for? Using all those words. Just tell it like how it is. Tell your story, my girl. And I try to remember that, and Douglas Cardinal was here speaking, the renowned Indigenous architect who have transformed this landscape with his amazing buildings. And his story is always you start with the elders because they can teach you. And then when you're gonna go into a community, start with a blank slate of paper. You don't come in as the knower. You be a blade of grass. You go in willing to accept and learn new things and accept criticism. And I'm really, really thankful for those Indigenous elders out there, those mentors, especially here on faculty, who have helped, guide this process, made it a little easier. Help me stay on this path with my little basket of berries and not pick too many berries on the side that distract me. And I'm thankful for that. And I just want to share quickly, like my son told me the other day, he said, Mom, why did you throw that banana peel in the garbage? Where's your ecological footprint? and I said, well, I'm sorry, son, I wasn't thinking because I was too busy thinking about making my own Indigenous footprint. And what I meant to that was where I am in this institution is like, so what is your Indigenous footprint? As a graduate Indigenous learner, and I ask other learners this, is how are you going to enhance, promote, share, utilize Indigenous knowledge that's going to serve your community? Again.
I love that. Indigenous footprints. Love it. Is there any other questions? Yes.
Danse. My name is Judy. I'm from the Sad Lake First Nations, and I'm a first-year PhD in the Department of Anthropology on a 4-year scholarship. So, and I work with the museum. So, and my MA focused on decolonizing Western perspectives, but it ties into decolonization, this roundtable discussion, and that. So one of the things that I think that should be included in this whole process is the idea of, you know, where politics come into play. Because the research that I'm conducting reflects decolonizing those Western perspectives. One of my main questions and challenges on these Western perspectives is the Cree came from Eastern Canada. And it's challenged by our oral histories, which date back to a real prehistoric time. So, you know, my model is going to reflect that, those oral histories and legends. So, you know, in the context of politicizing research, you know, for my first year in that is, you know, that support, you know, in my topic in that, you know, because you come in with different perspectives of decolonizing health, you know, math and sciences, literature and that. For me, it's the history, because I'd worked in a museum, so, and I'd worked with the Blackfoot repatriation and that, but I also come from a community that's been traumatized. You know, they were put, 4 bands were put into the community to live together, so they lost their identity, each tribalness of those communities and that. So for me, it's bringing back to the community what was lost through kind of like historical writings and literature and that. But at the community level, I mean at the university level, is establishing yourself. But, you know, when you open up a Pandora's box about the true history, it becomes almost a political research, because you know, you meet you create your alliances, your friendships, your mentors, but and even now I find that even the mentors that I had coming into the university don't want to sit in the committee in that because of, you know, the impact of research. So, you know, I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Wish me luck. I'm on the same page, I think, as you. And this is a conversation I've had with a lot of colleagues and friends and kin. Like, what does it mean to be political? And I always tell them, and specifically my young ones and my cousins and my niece, like, just the fact that we're here and talking and in this academy, like, the fact that we survived is political. So, like, everything that we do, I feel like every move we make, how we act, what we do, how we shift things, everything is political. But trying to get people to understand that is another question, right? I'm just always kind of read as like this killjoy or like a stick in the mud, as my mom and dad sometimes like to call me, because I can't, through the training that I've had, I suppose, and I can't just view a cultural object, like watch a film or, you know, read a story, listen to CBC, or, you know, drive down the Trans-Canada. Everything has a politics to it, but that politics is always hidden, I feel like, because it's a politics of comfort. It's a politics that always kind of reinforces settler colonialism, reinforces whiteness, reinforces heteropatriarchy. So for me, the way, as I move through the world, I think of my body as a political act, and all my work that comes from that, and all the stories that I tell from it are political, because I think everything is political. To be apolitical is a type of politic too. There's no such thing as being removed objectively and subjectively from a type of politic. If you think you are, then you're just comfortable. So I think it's my job to unsettle that and to shake that up. But in terms of history too, and working with literature and creating my own stories, I call myself an otachimo, a storyteller, because I don't think of myself as a poet or as a novelist or as a spoken word artist, because I think I blend all of those mediums together. I think of the performance as the most important part to writing and reading, because you're giving back to orality and you're bringing back those ways of knowing. But for me, thinking about history and an Indigenous person, thinking about communities. So keep it simple is something I'm always trying to keep in mind, and how I even allowed Western ways of knowing and theories to colonize my tongue. And then trying to give back, and you're like this divide where it's like they can't understand all these ologies, right? So trying to find words that are based within the language and the land and the vernaculars, or the everyday words that people are used to. So I have a lot of flack from academia, but also from my own Indigenous communities too, because the work I do is so heavily based on rethinking and repicturing and remembering what two-spirit livelihoods are, and what queer, Indigenous, trans, Indigenous, non-binary Indigenous peoples, how we are and how we survived and who we were. So the answer that I get anytime that you ask, like, who is a two-spirit person, I swear, like, everyone has this memorized. I didn't get this memo, but it's like, two-spirit people were revered shamans and oracles, period. It's like, they always have this, like, it's always were, and it's always, so we're always kind of placed in this peripheral sense within our own Indigenous and settler colonial histories of being these people who have been annihilated or been genocided completely. The word doesn't account for the was, doesn't account for the is, and it doesn't account for the where we're going to be. So my work in thinking about that in Indigenous ways of knowing also has its own pushback, because there's a lot of trauma around, I think, queerness that comes out of things like the 60 Scoop, residential schools, and ongoing colonial legacies. And so it's this trauma about queerness and queer sex, and I guess two-spirit livelihoods is so right now coiled, and it's wrapped around this pain. So me trying to undo that is at the same time, I'm also asking Indigenous peoples to decolonize themselves as well, right? To have this almost native to native reconciliation too, because at this point, as we say within Nehiyawi, we have to always kind of place our vulnerable in the center. And right now, two-spirit, queer Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women are always kind of placed on the peripheries, whereas others skirt-shamed, we can't enter ceremony. We have gender-based ways of knowing, even though our languages aren't. So yeah, in the same way, I think everything I'm doing is a political act, and I think I have to keep it as such. And sometimes I'll have to bite back against the communities who are going to push me out or make me peripheral, not include two-spirit people in the TRC. So I guess my word of advice is always keep it political and always keep it true to yourself and your own spirits.
I think just being Indigenous is political. But I would just say to you, stand your ground. You have access to story robes. You have access to what the bundles say. The winter counts. Those are our ways of knowing. And that's how you're going to counter that narrative. And my late uncle, Elijah Harper, he always said, I changed the face of this country by holding the eagle feather. And I didn't have the words to say. And it took me 11 days to say no.
We're going in order here. That's great. Well, I think I like what you said, Pearl. I think it's I'm talking within the context of ethnomathematics, and that in itself is very political. And that's a different form of it's history in itself, saying that that standard scientific method arose from the Industrial Revolution and capitalism and democracy and that kind of one way of knowing and colonization, right? And I find myself always trying to validate my research, comparing, I guess, to Western ways of knowing. And I have to retreat, I have to stop myself and say, hold on, this is, in itself is a valid way of knowing. and understanding those stories from the land, and really dwelling in that. I think it's really important. I have to catch myself, and I think, we're all political. It has to be political to just be here and to be doing this research, and like you said, just being Indigenous, absolutely.
I like what you said, Josh, about trying to be apolitical and not be involved in politics, and that's how I've always sort of seen myself, I'm not getting involved in that, until I got into graduate school, and I realized that even my experience in my undergraduate, it was very political. And this story just comes to mind. It was my first time I met with some of the community members, and I remember sitting down, and I went by myself, and we all sat in this boardroom around these tables and fancy chairs, and I thought, this does not feel okay, but just go with it, Ashley, because this is what is supposed to happen. So I went with it, and everybody started coming in, and I had this massive stack of white pieces of paper that needed dates and signatures and initials, and you needed to check this box and not this box, because if you check that box, then that means we can't do this other thing. And then I realized, you are very involved in politics, Ashley, and sometimes you need, like Pearl said, you need to find that strength in yourself to say no, that I'm not going to do that way, for not only from a personal reason, but for reasons of other people. So the people that were sitting around that table, I apologized, and I kept apologizing, saying, that this is not how I want to be meeting with you today, by saying, sign this, and we don't even know each other yet, and before we can even talk to each other, I'm constricted to talk to you by this political piece of paper that someone from somewhere is making me get you to sign. And I thought, this is not okay. And I realized that now, as I'm progressing through academia, that sometimes saying no is not always in this resistant sort of, no, I need to be different way, but you're saying no because you realize that this is not the right way to do things, and it's not being done in a good way. So it's okay. You can say no.
Because the reason why I, refer to this idea of politics within research is that I TA, and so I've met different Indigenous students within the classes and that. So there was this whole concept of label through the Indigenous strategy that happened, a couple months ago. And, I've heard some of the comments of, students being called squatters and that, so it was brought to a whole different level, of being a student on campus in that. And that's where that came from, and for me, that generated a little bit of fear and concern. So.
My name is Helen. I'm from Manitoba. I worked at Pegwis. I loved it greatly. And Pearl, I was wondering how many people here watched the movie Elijah. I am forever amazed how First Nations manages to convey that spiritual component. So if any of you don't know Pearl's great uncle, Elijah Harper, watch the movie. It is incredibly well done, and you'll understand what she's talking about when she says it took 11 days. And incredible. Political. I also worked up north in Thompson. In fact, the director at Pegwis Health right now was a student graduate in Thompson. I didn't remember her. She remembered me. But in Thompson, I was mandated. Do you guys know what that means? Mandated means if you don't use it, if you don't do what you're mandated, you can lose your job. So I was mandated by 3 superiors individually coming, which would have resulted in basically me bringing about the death of somebody. And the family was all around. I wouldn't do it, I couldn't do it, and that's why they kept calling the next person up in the hierarchy. So when we have our morals, when we have our ethics, when we are health-oriented, which is biological life, that's what it is. And life not just for individuals, but communities, then you make decisions. And that's part of the reason I ended up leaving there. And Peguis was an altogether different experience where I saw so much community and so much progress and continuing to progress. So I'm really happy to be here, and I love what you guys are doing. I am working on something, and I do want to talk to you guys later. And Judy, I met you before, right? I want to talk to you too. Thanks.
So, and I'll give us about 5 more minutes.
So just going off of Josh talking about the high school graduating class from Peguis coming here to visit him, and then hearing all of you talk about Josh's experience with oral history, your experience with Indigenous ways of knowing, traditional medicines, and all of those things sort of being met with maybe that they're a little invalid or something by the academy. What advice would you give to Indigenous kids graduating high school and looking to go to some sort of post-secondary, be it community college or all have their sights set all the way up to PhD or med school or something, knowing what you know now and maybe what barriers they may face? What would you tell like a grade 12 kid?
That's a great question. Thank you. I think I would tell them to be brave and do what you want to do. And, things are changing. And, I hope that the work that we're doing up here and the work that has been done before us, that it will make it easier for students to be empowered and to work with through their own ways of knowing, and to have that, to not have to justify and validate that in post-secondary and whatnot. And yeah, just my advice would be to be brave.
I currently have a school, grade 12 students watching us right now. And I currently teach with those students right now. So I still remain my connection to the community by teaching the students there, because that establishes that relationship. And that shows them that you can be in 2 places at one time contributing to a cause. So for them, how I mentorship them is through role modeling and showing them that this can be done this way, through a good, respectful way, and empowering them with knowledge and sharing my story, lived experience. This is how I went through. These are how other students experience their journey within the institution. And just most of all, telling them that it's okay. Empower yourselves. Be proud to be Siksika. Be proud to be Cree. Be proud to be Stoney Nakoda. Own it. You don't have to hang your head down in shame. We're in a place now where the country is changing. We're becoming unified in our ideas and our voices. We're strength in numbers, and it's happening. You can see that just by the census. Our population increased by 40%, and that's just because people are now, disclosing their identity. It's no longer shameful to be Indigenous, and to show them how to answer questions or experiences when they face discrimination, when they face systemic racism. How do you deal with that? Put them in a hypothetical situation. Well, how would you deal with this? And you give them strategies on how to speak in an informed way, but not through violence or through attacking. You show them through grace. You show them through how your ancestors taught you how to respond.
Thinking back to when I was in grade 12, I don't know if anything that anybody told me I would still have with me today, if that is coming out right. I think sometimes it comes from surrounding yourself with people who are able to teach you, those 7 teachings that sort of help ground you, and then they help build the courage from within. If you were to ask me when I was in grade 12 if I would be sitting here answering this question, it would be a really big no. I was quiet. I did what I was told. Even in my undergrad, up until I finished my 4th year, I didn't have a voice. I did what I was told. I got my degree, and I just went on. I was on this sort of conveyor belt from year to year. So I think I would say, ask questions. It's okay to not know. It's okay to be curious. It's okay to be different. It's okay to be unique. Just don't be silenced by that sort of silence cloud that you're put in when you come into academia. Sometimes you're first year in a lecture hall of 300 people and you think, oh, little me, I can't go ask this professor a question. And then that silence just ripple effects, and it just keeps going and going and going until you realize I've been silent for 4 years, and maybe if I wasn't, would I have learned more? Would I have learned less? What would the experience be? So I would say, to be strong, be determined, know that you can do anything that you put your mind to. My parents always told me that. My dad still says it. And when I have a bad day and I call him and I'm giving up. I'm gonna go live on a beach somewhere. And he says, no, you can do it. But if you don't wanna do it, it's okay. And we'll still support you. And there's another journey and there's another path that you will take. But he always says to not be afraid and to voice how you feel. And there will be someone, somewhere, sometime that resonates with you. And then that just builds those strong relationships that you need. Coming here not knowing anybody and starting a program where there's not very many Indigenous health researchers, let alone Indigenous students, I made sure that I had my voice there, and I met wonderful people like Pearl, I think, in my first week of being here. And it ripple affected by talking, and then I got to meet Vicky and Aruna and Corey, and it keeps going, so don't be silent.
I guess to quickly conclude, a lot of my cousins, I have a cousin right now, and my sister going back to school to post-secondary, which makes me so happy to see someone else kind of taking on and following that footstep and taking the little torch I've created. But a lot of my cousins like to see me as like the chosen one. It's like, oh, Josh, like you're so amazing that you went. Like we all look up to you, we love you. But I could never do that. And I just want to be like, I wasn't born like this. It takes hard work. I wish I could take that, But it's like I always say when I was working with the friendship centers, I was doing youth drop-in and summer day camps, and all my nieces and cousins. And just like why I write what I write in my stories that I'm creating, I say we need to see ourselves in order to know ourselves. I never had that opportunity to see someone succeeding from me because I was a first generation folks or person in my family to go on to post-secondary, but now you have me. So you follow me. I've opened these doors, I've broken some shit down, I've burned some things. So and I've just made space, and where there wasn't none before. I've succeeded in Manitoba, and I'm succeeding here in Alberta, and so can you. But for me, it only takes one. And the fact that I think because I'm here, because I'm doing what I'm doing, because I'm succeeding and thriving, and not only surviving, I think my presence is allowing others to do the same. So I see that my sister is returning to school. I have a cousin who's going to school, and I have a couple others who are very interested in like going on to post-secondary and kind of removing themselves from this tragic story of indigeneity that we all like to kind of rehash and recircle. I would say it's okay to fail. I failed many times. My first 3 years were me just kind of floundering around in University 1, taking psychology for God knows what reason why, sociology, who knows why, anthropology, random courses because I had to find myself. And then when I found what I was good at, I centered myself and I grounded myself. So I would say it's okay to fail, bend, don't break, and then use your indigeneity and use that to center how you're thinking, how you're being, and how you're going to etch out space. So as my narrator in my forthcoming book, Johnny, taught me, I need to stiffen yourself like sweet grass. So that's what I would say.
I'm going to add a quick comment. Sorry, Averna. It just, what you were saying, it sparked a thought in my memory, which doesn't happen very often these days. But I went to a gathering in Ottawa, and it was an elder youth gathering, and I met this lady. And every time she spoke, and we were all graduate students, well, most of us were graduate students coming to the gathering with an elder, or in hopes of going to post-secondary, and she kept saying before she spoke, you know, I don't have a degree, I didn't go to school, but I learned so much from that lady at that gathering. And it just made me, and it really hurt me that she kept saying, oh, I didn't go to school, I don't have these fancy degrees, I'm not doctor, whoever. And I went up to her after and I said, but it's okay. Like, you don't know how much you've taught me in 3 days just from being with you. It doesn't matter if I go to school and you don't go to school. And some of us do and some of us don't, and that's okay. And it just, when you're talking about being first generation, like my family does the same thing. Oh, Ashley here, Ashley there, and it's really nice and it's supportive, but sometimes you can be just as successful without those letters beside your name or that piece of paper hanging on the wall from your own experience in life. So, you know, if you feel pressured being in grade 12 to go to school, like that's just what the norm was. All of my friends applied, so I applied. I didn't know what I was doing, and I went, and I failed, and then I learned. So it's okay if you don't want to go to graduate school. You're still knowledgeable being you.
Thank you, that was wonderful. It reminds me too, as a second-year doctoral student in Workland, to remember why we're here. And often, like I was saying to Corey, I'm so tired today, I'm taxed. And so we often forget why we entered into these doors to begin with. And while Josh, you were talking, I was thinking about my 13-year-old. Just last week, I was, of course, tired, laying on the couch, and he comes up, and he's like almost as tall as me, but he crawls onto the couch with me, and he says, Mom, how am I ever gonna do it? And I said, well, do what? And he's like, well, look at you. You're getting your PhD and you're having all these jobs. Like, how am I going to do it? And I'm like, okay, whoa, my boy, you're 13. You can do it. But I think what I said to him is, you don't have to do what I do. You do what you want to do. And, you know, although we haven't had potentially those role models, hopefully we inspire people to follow what they want and what their gifts are. So from one doctoral student to another, merci for your courage and for your wisdom.
So I have some quick thank yous. This is the part where only if you're a student do you get to stay. So those of us who aren't will be leaving. And the streaming and the recording will now stop as well. But I do want to thank the Faculty of Graduate Studies, particularly Lisa Young, the GSA Quality Money Program. I want to thank Crow's Nest Hall and the Graduate College, who have been really good about being great hosts for this whole series. And I want to thank the team that is assisting me with this series as well. Ashley, Corey, and especially Vicky. Let alone your 13-year-old son, I actually wonder how she ever does all that she does, and keeps everyone else on track as well. So a big shout out to Vicky, who wouldn't have got me through this week if she hadn't been around. Thank you all for coming. This series has been very successful in all sorts of ways. And stay tuned we're going to try and do a larger symposium later in March. If you have any ideas for that, please let any of us know about that. A particular shout out to our speakers. This has been a great roundtable, and I want to express my gratitude. There are times I'm an old person at this university. I'm at the end of my career. And there are times that I forget what it is that I'm here for. And so it's roundtables like this and doing this work in the Faculty of Graduate Studies that does remind me, and hearing younger people like yourselves speak. So thank you very much. It's been a great afternoon for me.